Alright, so the next thing we're going to look at is the rendering tab, and this essentially is like a material editor in Max. What you're doing is you have your object, which is your container, and you want to begin to affect the shader and how it looks, the smoke, color, everything about it. Now there's a lot of different things within here that we're going to go through, and it's going to be pretty interesting to look at all of this stuff. A majority of the stuff in here that we look at, we do not need to re-simulate it all if we make any adjustments. It's only the fluid mapping primarily that we'd need to adjust, and also the channel editor stuff. So keep in mind that this is essentially something that we can adjust on the fly to get different results that we're after. First thing we'll look at is we have a couple of things in the rendering area here. Okay, so basically I'm just going to render out just something here that we can look at. So I'm just rendering out a quick close-up of Flameburst 2, just so we have some fire, and you'll notice that we have these little kind of streaky things going through it, kind of like artifacting. Now what we have here is the step size, and this is essentially that we're dealing with a Raymarcher shader, very similar to Maya Fluids, Pyro Effects in Houdini, Afterburn, the volumetric plugin for Max. This is essentially that we have a volumetric area and we have light stepping through it, or render steps marching through it as well, and this controls how much that we're actually putting into render calculations. So most of the time you probably don't need to adjust this unless you get too close, or you're dealing with something that is a little bit steppy. Now this is something that is purely just on the rendering side. This allows us to put more time into rendering render quality. Usually I'll either not adjust this at all, or if I do, I'll probably bring it down quite low to like 3, because the render times aren't going to be that much steeper, but we're definitely going to get more better render quality. As we can see right away by bringing that down, the render quality isn't that bad. It is about 3 or 4 times. Actually, it probably is about 6 times slower than it was before, but we're definitely getting great render quality out of it. I'm usually not concerned about my render times when it comes to fluids, unless I'm dealing with very high resolution volumetrics that require a lot of shadows and things like that, because that way they can actually get a bit slow. So this is a value just to keep in mind if you are getting a lot of artifacting. You will still see that I have like these little bits of artifacting, like kind of weird squares and stuff. That's because my simulation grid is so small. As we discussed before with a flower in Photoshop I showed you, with the very pixelated version, this is the sort of artifacting that you'll see. So this is something that you would adjust your step size, your spacing to resim it to get rid of those edges. You need a high resolution, but in terms of the shader itself, it's very high quality. At the same time, you can also turn off step size in Fire. You can enable this to have control the fire and the smoke individually. So this is useful if you want to have your fire have a much higher rendering quality, whereas your smoke maybe is a lot less. So these are ways you can balance the two. So that's really useful to have, just again as an additional thing to kind of help troubleshoot the quality of your work. The next thing we'll look at is jittering. Now jittering is something that's common with fluids in general, and it can be interpreted in a few different ways. Like, it depends on what you're doing. With fluid, like with fume effects, it's a little bit different, because what this is it's more a rendering solution, but there is also, you'll hear jittering to do with different types of ways to fill particles, let's say, inside of a shape or a fluid or something like that. There's a few different things, like depending on the specifically what you're doing, but these are just the same terminology used and applied to different methods. But jittering inside of fume effects, essentially what it'll do is it'll add randomness inside of the container, inside of the rendering solution. So essentially it's more of a spatial randomness to the actual sampling of it. So in other words, like if I were to crank this up to 100, we're going to get all this kind of crazy stuff going through it. However, you will notice you don't really see as much of that voxel issue that we had before, because it all kind of shifts a little bit. It kind of adds a lot more fuzz to it. So you wouldn't want it to be too high, but you might want to add a little bit to kind of help break it up a bit. So as you can see, we can definitely see, like if I bring this down to 0, we can definitely see all of this voxely information pushing through. So what I can do is I can bring my material, or my jittering up to, let's say 50, and bring my step size down to 6. Now the quality is good because my step size is low, but the jittering also gets massaged a lot more as well. So it kind of helps us get rid of the voxel kind of feel to it. And so this is just kind of useful as an additional thing to kind of help break up the voxely feel to your effect. But it does kind of help soften it a little bit too, so it's something to be kind of wary of, but again, it can be useful in some situations. The other thing to look at here is just our material ID, and just by changing this, it means that if we want to apply post-process effects to our stuff, then we can control them all individually. So if you have multiple ones or whatever, they all are easy to extract.